Hello, welcome to the 2022 Forum for Excellence recorded presentations. This year's conference is Cultivating Collaboration Through Conversations. So this conference is the Forum for Excellence conference sponsored by ICCB and ICSPS. And it's for our career and technical and adult education programs, building pathways for all students. So today, our presentation is called Team-Based Challenge Accepted. So we're happy to be joining you today. My name's Allison Gaspar. I'm the Career and Technical Education Services Manager at Waubonsee Community College.
Hi, and I'm Andrea Montgomery. I am Assistant Professor for Fire Science Technology and Emergency Medical Technician at Waubonsee.
Hi, I'm Margie Schofield. I'm an Associate Professor of Nursing and the Nursing Program Director here at Waubonsee Community College.
Lisa Geese was unable to join us today, but we wanted to make sure we referenced her. She's our instructor of medical assistant and phlebotomy programs, and she was an integral part of this the event that we're going to share with you today. So just to give you some information, Waubonsee's Aurora Fox Valley campus is located on the Rush Copley Medical Center campus in the far eastern portion of Waubonsee's district. The campus opened in January 1997 and was renovated in 2016 and now houses most of our college healthcare programs. And those include the Emergency Medical Technician Basic Program, our Medical Assistant Program, our Nurse Assistant Program, our Nursing Program, and our Phlebotomy Program. And so we wanted to make sure that the location of these programs being housed within the same campus was really integral to putting together the event that we're going to talk about today. So today we're going to talk with you about the healthcare skills event that we put together. We collaborated to put together. We're going to talk with you about how it was developed, how it was implemented, what the outcome looked like, and some lessons we learned from our very first team-based challenge. So this project or this event really started with our program of study approval form. So one of the first programs that we were working on the POS approval form was our medical assistant program. And one of the components we needed to address was the work-based learning quality component for team-based challenges. So medical assistant and our EMTB and our nursing programs definitely all have hands-on components, work-based learning components, but we didn't have in place team-based challenge components yet. So in my initial conversations with Lisa, we talked about, what is a team-based challenge going to look like for medical assistant? And that sort of evolved into, could we include other programs of study? What programs might be a good fit? What programs do students have overlapping skills or complementary skills that we could build an event for? And really, what would that look like? So that's where we started with this whole process.
So in some of the past classes that we've had, because we are all housed at the same facility, EMT, nursing, CNA, medical assistant, we have chosen in the past to try to work together just to make simulation a little bit more robust and a little bit more interesting for both the students and to integrate the pieces of what communication looks like throughout this particular event. So we have had in the past our EMT instructor doing full cardiac arrest scenarios. We've had nursing instructors working with the EMT students delivering babies in our simulation lab where we have the simulator that can actually do that. And then we've had some different simulation scenarios where we've been somewhat informal, but we've worked together to provide scenarios such as a child who falls and the EMT students are the ones who bring the child to the nursing lab where the nursing students take over and do care. One interesting way that we incorporated another part of the healthcare programs was to have sign language interpreting as part of our simulation. So we had the interpreting students coming and either playing the role of a parent of a child who could not, or so they could not hear and the child would have to interpret for them, or they played the role of the patient themselves. And our students, our nursing students, would learn how to communicate with a different population of patients that they didn't normally get to interact with. And so these were just some of the ways in the past that we've been working together on a very informal basis. And then there were three. So the three programs that we decided really could collaborate well and were available at the times that we needed to were the medical assistant program, the emergency medical technician basic, the EMTB program, and the registered nursing program. So these had the most overlap. They were the ones that were easily translatable to have a scenario that could start one place, involve another group, and then end up in a third setting. And so that's basically how we began to develop this team-based challenge, was on this particular idea.
So the plan was to, each program would identify teams of 2 to 4 students. They would work together to transition a patient through the medical assistant, the EMTB, and the nursing program labs for treatment. Our volunteer patient started in the medical assistant lab. They then transitioned to the care of the EMTB students. And then we ended up in the nursing lab. Students were assessed by an external partner. So we included some of our employer partners or industry partners from the area. And students received a score and potentially feedback regarding the demonstration of their skills. Students and faculty then debriefed after the event to highlight the areas of strength and then opportunities for improvement. So in the initial planning phases, the faculty worked together to develop a scenario of what this event was going to look like. They each created their own rubric. So each group of students were assessed using a program specific rubric. And then industry judges were identified for each area. And then we were also able to identify a volunteer patient for this process.
So in developing the scenario, as Margie mentioned earlier, once we chose the 3 programs that were going to participate in this first time event, we had to choose programs where we had similar scopes of practice, similar abilities, so that we could choose one patient that would come in initially with a specific complaint, and all 3 programs had the ability to treat that condition, had skills and treatments they could perform on a patient with that condition. So choosing a scenario was really important, and that it would realistically carry over from the medical assisting lab all the way through these 3 programs. So we sat down, the 3 instructors, looked at our scopes of practice, looked at just in the real world, what usually happens. So the patient started off in the medical assisting lab, which, if you're not maybe familiar with what exactly a medical assistant is, a lot of times if you go to an urgent care or even a doctor's office, there's that initial person that meets you in the room and they kind of get a history, what's going on today? How do you feel? And they kind of get a history of your meds and those types of things. And a lot of times people just assume that that's a nurse, but a lot of times that's a certified medical assistant that's in the room with you. So they were that person to first address this patient and kind of find out what's going on, and then realize that maybe this is something that was not necessarily treatable in this doctor's office or urgent care setting. So they had to then call EMS to transport this patient to a hospital setting. So we ended up choosing a patient that kind of just came in with a general, I don't know, I just don't feel well, that as they asked more questions, they realized was actually a cardiac event. So they were having chest pain. something that was more urgent that they could then call EMS for, and then could then translate into several higher level skills, even for the nursing students at the end. So when we put together our rubrics, because we were inviting these industry professionals to come be kind of guest judges, if you will, we wanted to have something fairly simple laid out for them so we could, just hand it to them and they'd very quickly be able to look at it. So we just went with a basic kind of 0 to 5 skill as far as the skills, the communication, the treatments the students were performing. We also had kind of a script typed out. Allison mentioned that we had our volunteer patient. We tried to make sure we had a patient who is a certified EMT, has often worked in similar scenarios like this in an ambulance, taking a patient from a doctor's office to a hospital. So the patient was familiar with what's going on, and we kind of gave them a typed out script of, when questions are asked, what would the answers be, just to keep that scenario consistent, because we ran that same scenario 3 times and we wanted to make sure it was consistent for all these teams. So as they were scored, it would be a consistent answers, consistent scenarios. So we came together, found something that would work for everybody, kind of typed out this script, and then progressed through it, and it worked fairly well. So since Lisa isn't here, I'm going to start off kind of covering the medical assisting aspect of it. So for each program as instructors, once we knew what the scenario was going to be, before we developed our rubrics, we kind of sat down and thought, okay, what are our goals? What do we want to see from our students? So medical assisting, again, was that first point of contact. The patient walks into the doctor's office, they go into their simulated room, which the medical lab has these nice simulated kind of little cubicles that simulate a doctor's office room. And the first thing was just simply communication, greeting that patient, listening to them, and understanding what was going on. And then understanding their knowledge and recognizing as they spoke to this patient that this was an urgent situation. The instructor, Lisa, then kind of played the role of like the doctor in the doctor's office. So that medical assistant student would kind of step out and say, hey, doctor, we think we have something more urgent here. So just recognizing that. Once they recognized that and they, called EMS to have them on the way, they then did a basic patient assessment. We wanted to ensure that they could get vital signs, they could perform a 12-lead EKG, all of which are in their scope of practice. So things they have learned in class and should be able to do. We wanted to ensure that they could then document this so that when the EMS crew showed up, they would have some of this documented of what care they've already given, and then be able to verbally hand over that report. So when the EMS crew walked in, said, hey, we're here, what's going on? They could kind of summarize what they've learned from the patient, the vitals they've gotten, and kind of give that first step assessment to the EMS crew to then continue on their care. So that was kind of the expectations of what we were looking for from those medical assisting students. So this is just a little quick summary of the rubric that the judges had. Again, we tried to keep this fairly simple to where it could be held on a clipboard with a single sheet of paper. We tried not to get too in depth. So acquiring the chief complaint, in other words, just how quickly could they identify what's wrong with this patient? And then kind of get those clarifying questions, the level of pain, and some things to determine, again, the urgency of this. So how quickly they realized that they needed to call EMS was important. They then got their vital signs. Again, they then step out and spoke with the physician who was the instructor, and explained to them what was going on. So again, communication skills, which you'll see as a common thread through all of this. And then calling 911 and giving that report to EMS. So simple little rubric there that we tried to go with. So just some things that as instructors, we kind of stood back and watched our teams. We tried not to guide them at all. So some things that we saw, we tried to pick out some of the positives, the things that really went well, and then some areas that we saw that we feel they should improve in, which we could, of course, then hopefully take back to our classrooms and emphasize in further class sessions so that when we run these scenarios again, we see improvement. So we realized the medical students really worked very, very well as a team. They had 3 medical assistants there, and we were looking to see that everybody was active, everybody was involved, nobody was standing around, and they did that very well. They're just basic skills of obtaining vital signs and obtaining an EKG. This is something they've practiced in the classroom a lot, but doing it on that person they've never met before, because we tend to do all this on our either mannequins or simulation mannequins or even fellow classmates. But there's kind of a comfort level there. So doing this on somebody they had not met before, they did very well with that. and just overall what their expectations were that they would do as a medical assisting. They achieved that very well. So that was something that we were happy with. One thing we did realize is that in their questioning is they got to that point where they realized like, wow, maybe this is something a little more than should be in the doctor's office. Again, that's something that's kind of difficult to simulate in our individual classrooms when we don't have that interaction with other individuals and other healthcare providers. And so once they realized that, there was kind of this moment where everything got a little quiet and everybody kind of started slowing down a little bit and maybe not communicating as much with the patient and just really focused on, oh no, what do I have to do now? So that constant interaction in that more urgent situation that we tried to simulate, that's hard to do in our individual classrooms, and continuing that good communication and not that they froze up, but they just got really focused on that situation sometimes, and kind of slowed down a little. So that was something that we realized that maybe we could somehow implement in our own classrooms a little better going forward. So EMT, you'll see there's some very similar threads here. So once the medical assisting students realized it was urgent, they called 911, which was just then I, as the instructor, had my EMT students kind of staged over in our classroom with our cot from our ambulance and all of our equipment. And I would just give them then a verbal, you know, there's been a 911 call to the local doctor's office for a possible cardiac patient. We gave them just 1 or 2 minutes to kind of gather their thoughts that would simulate kind of that drive time. And then they were to walk into the medical assisting lab with those simulated doctor's office and kind of do what they would do in the real world. So again, a big thread that we're always looking through all of this is communication, because that's something that's very, very difficult to simulate in our individual classrooms and our individual labs, is that communication with other healthcare providers. So walking in, greeting the medical assistant team, greeting the patient, and getting that initial report. After that, how quickly did they start making decisions on what they should do next based on what the medical assisting team told them? Getting the patient then transferred over from that bed in the doctor's room to our cardiac monitor, our cot, our equipment, to where we're ready then to take them out to our simulated ambulance area. So just the logistics of that, again, which is that's something we don't often do in our classroom. So just the logistics of getting all that equipment moved over. Once they had them in the simulated ambulance area, then doing their own assessment, their own vital signs. Again, simple things we've practiced numerous times in the classroom, and then choosing next step treatments. We then had the next progression, which was that they would kind of gather their thoughts, gather what they've done, and then give that report to the nurses. Now, in the real world, in case you're not familiar with our scope of practice and how we go, from the ambulance, we actually call on a radio to the emergency room and tell them, we're en route with this patient, here's his condition, here's what we've done. And so we actually call them on a radio. And that's, again, a very different skill that our students, we practice in the classroom, but again, doing it with other healthcare professionals, we don't do very often. So we have radios in the EMT lab. And so we had one, and then we had the other one over in the nursing lab in the hospital, the simulated hospital. So we actually called them on the radio and they had to answer. And I'm sure Margie will talk about that in her part. And then walking in and kind of giving that face-to-face report. And again, just the logistics of transferring them from our cot then to the hospital bed. So we were just looking for all that to run how it would in a real call. Again, you can see our rubric here, very similar. Our rubric was very much just kind of skills and scope of practice based on just the checklist, so to speak, of what we're looking for from them. So very similar to what we saw in medical assisting. Also, I'd like to mention, sorry, before Allison switches the slide here, you can see in this picture, this is kind of a good example. Our medical assisting lab, we set up all of our labs here at our Fox Valley campus to try and simulate the real world environment as much as possible. So they have these little kind of cubicle areas with a curtain like you would in a hospital room or a doctor's office. And currently you can see the patient here is on our EMS cot, and just to the right of it, you can see where the hospital bed was. So just that tight space, and the medical assisting students had kind of stepped back at this point, but we had 3 EMTs, 3 medical assisting students, the patient, the cardiac monitor, in this tight space. And so just even learning to work in that situation was very unique. And something that they really, I feel like, gained a lot out of in this experience. So just some observations, again, that initial, because they were really prepped and ready, right? They were really prepped and ready, and they're just excited to get going. And so that initial walk in, that initial communication with the medical assisting team. Hi, we're with the ambulance. What do you have? With the patient was great. Again, we're looking for that same aspect of everybody's working, everybody's moving, nobody's standing around. We have very specific protocols in EMS that we have to follow because we don't always have a doctor right there with us. So we kind of have some standing operating procedures that they're expected to know without having to necessarily call the doctor for every little piece of advice. And so knowing those protocols, knowing what their next step treatments were allowed without having to ask, and they did very well on all that. Again, we found a very similar thread that once they got the initial care of that patient, and then we actually had the patient, when they were in the care of EMS, they initially were complaining of chest pain. And as they were doing some treatments, we had that patient simulate becoming unconscious. And so he just kind of stopped answering questions and, became unconscious. And again, once that emergency situation happened, or that something else happened, everything, they kind of slowed down and quit talking and we're really trying to, get focused on what they're doing, which we do, but in the real world, we have to keep moving as well. So we kind of realized that, again, that was another thread similar to medical assisting that we need to keep working on. So adapting to the situation at hand. Our students, a lot of times, they have these skills checklists that they know they're going to have to do, like, okay, in lab today, we're going to do a full arrest, or we're going to do this. And they study it and they know all the steps and they know what the expectations are, but they kind of get a little too checklist based sometimes. And so then when you throw a little wrench in things, their ability to adapt and change to that situation is really important in all of our healthcare fields. And so we need to keep working on that piece, and that just kind of reemphasized that.
So then nursing got involved. So we got the report on the radio from Andrea's group of EMT students. And I'll say, first of all, for my students, that was the first, like, oh, this is different. This is not that really back and forth question answer that they are used to when they're talking with a patient. Let me even just kind of back up just for a moment and tell you about the group of students that we chose to do this particular event. So we had a couple of students in our honors society who needed to do a project in order to graduate and have their full honor society opportunity to complete. And so these students, there were 3 of them, there were supposed to be 3 of them, decided that they would be willing to do this without knowing anything about it in order to complete their project. These were students, these 3 students were students that were in the very final semester of the class. They were just about ready to go into their leadership class. They were in the middle of their critical care rotation. So it wasn't out of the question that they should understand what a cardiac arrest or that type of a patient would look like. In addition, the nurse who typically runs our simulation was having clinical that day. And so she brought her students over so that she could run the simulator, and her students could be the extra nurses in the ER that took direction from the students that were running the scenario. So the little bit older students, the ones that were closer to graduating, became the charge nurses in the ER, and they directed the 2 other students who were nurses in the simulated emergency room. So for our goals and expectations, we really wanted to make sure that their communication was professional. Our advisory boards that we meet with various clinical sites over twice a year at least. And so over the years, what we've been hearing is that students who graduate do not do a good job with communication with anyone other than the patient themselves. They get that part down really well, but it's that how do I talk to a doctor? How do I talk to a coworker? How do I talk to all these different professionals that they have to deal with in real life? And so that's something we've taken very seriously and tried to incorporate into our simulations. We also wanted them to have very effective clinical decision-making. It's really important that they're starting to see the clues and the direction that a patient is going. Are they getting better? Are they staying the same? Are they getting worse? And so they needed to do some of the same roles as Andrea's talked about with both EMT, with medical assistants. So they needed another set of vital signs, those type of things, so they could see those trends. They were performing, again, the charge nurse and bedside roles of an emergency department, and then they performed the secondary patient assessment. So we get that initial assessment that Andrea's group did. Now, in the emergency room, they're going to hone in very quickly on what is really the problem and what do we need to do. They were supposed to be providing the appropriate medications, communicating with physicians and ancillary departments. We simulated that they were having a bit of a cardiac arrest where they needed to actually have CPR performed. And then they needed to give report to the cath lab so that the patient could go for a procedure to correct whatever was going on or to find out what the problem actually was. Here was our rubric that we did. So we were looking at, was the charge nurse delegating and being proactive with good communication to the physician? Did they communicate with the family? Was there CPR that was initiated? And so some of the skills then that we were looking for was, did they recognize they needed the crash cart at the bedside when that patient got there? What other things were needed? And so those were very specific. And then we gave points as to, were they able to recognize how quickly they needed to get that patient to the cath lab? It was at this point, though, that when Andrea brought her live patient over, that we switched it to our simulated mannequin that we could actually control from the control room. And so they could actually do CPR on that particular mannequin. Some of the positives, the students worked really well as a team. They did talk about delegation. They delegated the responsibilities. One of the nurses, the charge nurse, would say, you go be the med nurse. So I need these things to be done. We need to get labs drawn. So we had a lab station set up where they could actually simulate drawing labs and getting them down to the laboratory for stat results. They did well communicating with the EMT group. They asked appropriate questions when it was necessary. Otherwise, they just took down the information, got the bed ready, and was ready to really quickly take care and charge of that situation. Most of the time, CPR was initiated pretty quickly. Once they recognized because we are able to have the EKG showing on a monitor, when they realized that there was not that rhythm that they were looking for, they did recognize then at that point that if they did not have the crash cart there, that they had to get it and get started on it quickly. And again, I talked about how the senior students, the ones that were almost ready to graduate, took on that charge nurse role. What we did find, as Andrea mentioned, with both the medical assistant as well as the EMT students, is the students often froze a little bit when they had that emergency situation that they did not have any idea as to what was presenting come in and where they had to start performing. And so because of that, when there was that time frame, even though they delegated responsibilities as a team, delegation was a little bit slower than we would have liked to have seen. So it's going to be one of those things that we need to work on differently. And we may need to add another, maybe a freshman student, so to speak, to be that CNA student or something like that when we don't have access to other people. So getting that opportunity to really delegate in different ways. And then skills were not done as quickly as we wanted. It sometimes took 5 or 7 minutes or longer to draw labs and get those going, to pull medications, to give the second nitroglycerin tablet took very long. And so there were a number of things that just didn't go as quickly and as smoothly as we would have liked to see in those particular times. And we did notice that there were definitely the need for more than just the 3 students that we had on each scenario. We probably needed to double that amount in order to get everything done in a almost seamless manner that we saw was not there at that particular time. So some of the benefits, though, there were definitely positive feedback from the students. As much as the initial worry about them was they were scared about what they were going to face, they still did a really nice job, and they were excited that they had to think. And that was something that they felt like was a real positive for them, because that was more like real life than anything else they would have. Additionally, I think that we saw that there was that opportunity as a benefit to collaborate not only within the different nursing groups that we're working, but to be able to work with that EMT person, to be able for the EMTs to work with the MA students. And we've talked about how could we even expand that at some point in time to either include more groups or to kind of come full circle with different things. It did feel more real with the scenarios that they had with their classmates than just doing a simulation where they get a chart on a patient who is being simulated that they're in the hospital. So they get a lot of information about that particular case. This one offered really good ability and opportunity to think more critically, to make good clinical judgments. They would collaborate with either each other or with the one of us who was playing the doctor to get that assurance that they were either doing the right thing or they had to make a different decision. And overall, whether it was the MAs, the EMTs, or the nursing students, they all had to think quickly, think on their feet, make quick decisions, turn on a dime, and maybe consider something that they weren't thinking of before in order to provide the appropriate care in the time frame that they were given.
Yeah, I'd like to just add in there, Margie, too, when we talk about the realistic feel of it. You know, even when we role play in class, whether we're role playing that, you know, I'm the doctor and you're the EMT, you're the patient, even though we're all healthcare providers, we don't necessarily all speak the same language. So in other words, a lot of times, you know, we may, you know, kind of just already know what they mean when they say something, and they didn't really have to explain it in our own classrooms because it's their fellow students and they know what they're supposed to be doing. Also just knowing each other's scopes of practice. So for example, my EMT students were kind of surprised that the medical students had gotten a 12 lead EKG. They're like, oh, we didn't know they could do that. And I think the same thing on the other end. Sometimes the nursing students were surprised that the EMT students had given a certain medication. They're like, oh, wow, we didn't know they could do that. So I think that realism there too of understanding a little bit more about those other jobs and those other roles and was important. Because again, when we role play in the classroom, we kind of know what's supposed to happen next, right? We kind of know what they're supposed to say. So we tend to not have to explain that as much. So I think that was really interesting as well. And also they all knew that they were being watched by somebody they didn't know. So those industry judges, and you know, they get a little competitive, right? Because they knew they were getting a score and they knew there was going to be a winner and a loser here. And so while they had a lot of fun, they really, you know, were focused, and there was a lot of camaraderie, like you said, between everybody. And in the end, they just really had a lot of fun. So obviously we wanted to learn from them and gain this experience, but everybody, I think, just really had a lot of fun too.
So again, like I was saying, we did determine through reflection that we in nursing needed a larger team for the scenario because of the amount of things that were going on. One poor girl was doing CPR alone for about 5 to 7 minutes. And we all know that if you're doing CPR, it's really nice to have that ability to tag off and let somebody else help. And so this really kind of tiny girl is up on the bed just doing CPR, you know, nonstop, because she knew that was her role at the moment and there was nobody to take over for her.
Some other observations. I think right away we realized that this whole process was going to take a lot longer than we had anticipated. We booked, I think this was scheduled to be like a 2-hour event, and we were going to cycle through, the patient, the scenario 3 times. And right away, we realized students are not moving as quickly as anticipated. So that was something that that I think in the next go around we would take that into account. I think we could have benefited, and I believe we had maybe booked more than one volunteer patient, but we had we had some issues that day, and we ended up with 1 volunteer patient. And probably 2 would have been, more than 1 would have helped us kind of get things, cycle through quicker. I will say having the patient be from a healthcare background was very helpful. This individual I could tell he was drawing from his own personal experience. He was, at points he was disagreeable with, like, no, I'm not going to go to the hospital. I don't think I need to go to the hospital. And I remember at one point, he even mentioned, he pointed out, he's like, everyone's getting so quiet. What's going on? Is something bad happening? And so I thought he did a really great job. So I think, having a great volunteer patient would be really key for this kind of activity. But he did a really great job. So more volunteers, more people would have been helpful. I think it would have been, it moving forward, having more students, we'd like to see more students be able to participate. We were just doing this for the very first time. So I know that I believe, it sounds like Margie, you had some criteria for who participated. And I think in medical assistant, I think some of it was like on a volunteer basis, who wants to participate in this. And I don't believe it was mandatory. But I think afterwards, I think there was folks that really were like, hey, I want to do that. When are we doing this again? And then I think the students that were not participating and like competing, I think it was agreed that, it would be great to have students observing the other programs. So having medical assistant students observe the EMT students, and the nursing students observe the medical assistant, to kind of get that idea of like what happens in other programs as well. So for next year, we'll definitely try to schedule some additional patients, so that way there's less downtime for those, because really we didn't start again until the patient was available to begin again. So having multiple patients would allow us to create the cycle, faster. Having some extra support, extra judges, I think would be nice as well. We had 1 for each area. And now that, we've been through this once already, I think it would be nice to have, some additional feedback, more than 1 person providing feedback to students. Increasing the number of students who can participate, encouraging students to observe the other programs, and then considering involving other programs or other faculty or students to observe. So, if maybe some students in the CNA program would like to, sometimes those students are considering, entering other fields. So maybe this is an opportunity to get CNA students involved in what's it like to be in these programs, or other faculty that are, even if they're not from within the same pathway area, maybe they would like to know how other folks are doing it so that they can implement it in their own programs, kind of be inspired.
Allison, could I add something there too?
Please.
I think that it would almost be beneficial to do this type of thing on a scheduled day rather than like in a scheduled like 2 or 3 hour period, in order to get more students through, in order to get the ability to really have that participation increased. I think that, like we talked about, that 2 hour time frame wasn't enough, but that was what we had at this particular time. I think that potentially being able to run it through with the extra patients and having teams ready to go, or even in our situation with the nursing side of things, where we could have taken a little bit longer for some of ours to role play and finish out, maybe even having 2 simulation rooms going. So the first patient could go in one room, the second patient could go in the next room, and we could kind of keep that going in different ways.
Great. And then I'll just kind of mention as well, you know, I was with the medical assistant students for a lot of this event, and I know that the ones that were volunteering to participate were all very nervous. I kind of had to give them a pep talk at the beginning, just to remind them this is all about a learning experience. There's no winners or losers. And so, and then, you know, afterwards, they were all really provided a lot of positive feedback about what a great experience. And I think the students themselves realized how different this was than their normal role playing that they do in the classroom. So I think having an opportunity to work with people that they're not working with regularly was really helpful to them.
Agreed. And then I think also too, because mine, same thing, they were so nervous, but afterwards, I think they almost kind of surprised themselves. They're like, wow, like we did really well. Like we knew a lot of stuff, you know, and I think they almost kind of surprised themselves, and then getting that feedback from the judge that was, hey, you did this great, and you did that great, and your time was only this. And they were really proud of themselves, you know, for kind of entering that situation where they didn't know what to expect, and realizing that all the things they've been practicing in class and all the things they've been learning paid off, and they could see the results of that. So that was really fun too.
So how could other areas participate in a team-based challenge? So I would just, you know, encourage folks to think about, certainly, you know, a team-based challenge could just be done within one program area. I think having an event like the one we did, I think was really like a richer experience for students. And also I think for faculty as well. I feel like the faculty all learned something about how, you know, they were going to take this experience and adapt their, you know, make changes to their classroom or adapt the lessons learned. And so I think, you know, certainly you could do it as a standalone program, but it was really interesting to, you know, involve multiple programs. So, you know, maybe consider, I think also time-wise, we're all strapped for time. So it's kind of more efficient to bundle three in one. I think you can also think about, you know, where do programs and student skills intersect or overlap? So could something be done with students that are pursuing business, accounting, marketing programs? I think, you know, you can find a way that, you know, a project is gonna, whether it's there are things that are overlapping or intersecting. Manufacturing, I think, you know, there's a world in which, you know, CAD students could create a design, and then CNC students or welding students then have to like execute the design. And I think that's a worthwhile activity to explore. You know, certainly there's ways to engage automotive and auto body students, and, you know, what are the overlapping, intersecting skills in those fields to kind of get students working together. Also woods, electrical, HVAC, you know, where do students, where could they collaborate? Where could they learn from each other? And then computer support and cybersecurity, you know, how can you have a ticket get called in and have a computer support student then transition it to a cybersecurity student? So I also want to put in a plug for, you know, for folks that are interested in exploring this option, but aren't really sure where to go, where to start. We found some, you know, I found some initial inspiration from the iWin Resource Hub at the Ed Systems NIU website. So they did have some templates for those that, you know, like templates to kind of, you know, get their ideas flowing. There are some planning templates. And then also there are some ideas saved there, some activities that people have done already that might be worth, you know, implementing either in part or in full.
Yeah, I think the big thing is don't be intimidated. I know this sounded like a lot, but we all know our areas. And once we kind of decided who would mix well together, it was really about us kind of putting together our own part and what I expect from my students and my rubrics. And it was only a couple meetings to kind of figure out where those would cross and coordinate. So don't be intimidated thinking it's this huge thing and it's going to be all this work and all these meetings. I think we were all pleasantly surprised that we know our own areas. We're kind of experts at that. And then a little coordination in between, it really went very smoothly. So think outside the box and don't be intimidated.
And I would just add that reality-based learning is something that is so valuable for students, and it gets them really thinking differently. And I think that's helpful overall in their ongoing studies and they're getting ready for the real life that they are, working to have a job in one day.
Agreed. Well, so thank you so much for viewing our presentation. If you have any questions after viewing this, I've shared our email addresses. We would be happy to engage with anyone. I've also listed Lisa Geese, our instructor for medical assistant and phlebotomy, because I know she is very open to answering any questions you have about her area as well. So thank you so much for your participation. And if you have an opportunity to complete a feedback form, please do so. And you can connect with the moderators or with ICSPS later if you have any additional questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.